Dr. Kevin Mitchell, welcome to Bendix and Airways.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. When I got out of bed this morning, I think I put my right foot on the floor first. Could I have put my left?
That's an interesting one because it's one of those things that actually, we do quite habitually, right? So when we get out of bed, when we do something like that, when we're say brushing our teeth, we actually have a fixed, almost habitual motor pattern. And if you think about it, you'll find you're always doing this bit first and then
Yeah,
this bit and so on.
yeah.
Um, so it's interesting to think in terms of, yeah, free will. What does that mean for whether we could have done it otherwise? Just because we habitually do tend to do it one way doesn't mean we couldn't do it another way if we decided to, right? So, next time you're brushing your teeth, now you're probably going to be messed up because I made you think about it. And you'll be like, oh, shoot, what am I doing?
Yeah.
But you'll see you could do it with your left hand if you want to, maybe. So yeah, I think yes, you could have done otherwise. Um, I think that's the feeling that we have most of the time when we think about it, right? And so it's interesting if we're talking about free will to just think what's the phenomenon that we think needs explaining? Like, what are we talking about? And to me, that phenomenon is that um, sense that we could have done something differently, the sense that we're in control, that putting your right or left foot down first doesn't make much of a difference, but deciding who to invite on your podcast, that's a decision that you deliberate over.
Mm.
And it feels like something to be doing that, right? And that's the phenomenon that needs explaining, that it feels like we're making decisions, we're acting for reasons, we can even think about those reasons, and so on. So for me, that's kind of the starting point is just to describe those phenomena in the world and then try and think how we should think about them.
Yeah. Before we move on, how would you introduce yourself?
Well, let's see. Professionally speaking, I'm a developmental neurogeneticist. Well, that's a slightly made up term. And basically, my interests have always lain at the intersection of genetics and neuroscience, and developmental biology. And so, generally, sort of connecting those three things, and then, more recently thinking not just how do brains develop, but how does the way that they develop affect the way that they work? How does that manifest in terms of minds, not just brains? So things like personalities, but also decision making and other kinds of cognitive functions. So, yeah, I guess over my career, it's veered from, very basic kind of molecular developmental cell biology and genetics to well, I suppose philosophy at this stage, or philosophical issues at least.
Yeah. Can you expand on what's the difference between a mind and a brain?
No. I mean, no, I can't. I wish.
No.
It's funny, like we all use this, the term mind, and we use it colloquially, but cognitive scientists use it, of course, philosophers use it. I don't think anybody has a good definition of it, actually. And even the word, um, even the fact that it's a noun is a problem, I think, in the way that we
Mm.
think about it, because it makes it sound like it's an object. And when it's an object, then it's like it's separate from your brain, but somehow they're related to each other. That's just a confusing way to think about it. Whereas if you think of, let's say, mentality as an
Mm.
adjective, right? Or mind as a verb as opposed to a noun. It's a set of activities. It's a kind of mentality is a sort of mode of being or a set of relations that gets you away from this dualist version where you've got the brain here, and then somehow the mind is this other thing,
Yeah.
and they need to talk to each other. The mind is produced by the brain as opposed to mental activity being entailed by, neural activity of a certain kind. Um, and it's really hard to get away from that object view of the mind towards a view that's more like a set of processes and relations and so on. But I feel like we need to, otherwise you just get trapped in a way of thinking that you can't get out of.
And the same question around mental and physical.
Yeah, it's
Everybody uses it. Is there
right.
a difference, really?
Well, let's see. Um, I guess what I would say is that some kinds of physical processes are also mental processes, and some aren't. So I think there's a difference. I don't think it's well delineated or described what that difference is or what it means. And again, when people talk about the physical versus the mental, they're putting up this barrier that makes it seem like they're different realms. And I
Mm,
think the way I think about it is that some kinds of neural activity um, entails mental experience and is mental, whereas other types of neural activity doesn't. For example, you can have neural activity in your optic nerve that eventually will give rise to a mental experience, but just the optic nerve itself, that there's no mental operation going on there. That's not part of your mental um, goings on, really, I would say. I mean, maybe that's arguable, um, but that's the idea that, I mean, just to not give a total cop out, I guess one way to think about the mind is that it's the sort of higher level arena where you're doing cognitive operations over cognitive objects that are things like a belief that there's something out in the world, or
mm.
a goal state that I have, or a desire to do something, an intention, and so on, right? So those are elements. That's the cognitive furniture in my mind. Whereas in my mind, I'm not thinking about a photon hitting my retina, right? That doesn't make its way into my mind. And
Mm.
so, in a control theory kind of way of thinking about it, if we just kind of set aside mysteries of conscious experience and so on, we just think about a control theory, you could say it makes sense to have a top level um, arena that filters out lots of this bottom, these details, and only acts on the inferences that we make. So in our visual system, we make inferences about what's out in the world, going through all these layers and layers and layers of visual processing until we get to a point where we sort of realize there's a computer in front of me and there's a lamp on this table, and so on, right? And if I want to think about things, I can think about the computer and the lamp on the table, but I'm not thinking about all of the operations that led to those inferences. Those are
Yeah.
subconscious, and you could say then maybe they're not mental or not mental in the same way.
But do you think everything is physical? Is everything that we experience happening inside this body?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything supernatural going on. I don't think we need to think about it. We don't need to be sort of mystical about this, right? But when you say everything is physical, we already right there have an assumption that everything is a thing.
Yeah.
This is going to sound really, really philosophy, right? But you can think about things as processes as opposed to objects, right? You can say
Yeah.
there are goings on there are neural goings on that have a physical basis, but they're not objects, right? So
Mm.
distinguishing between processes and objects, I think helps get us out of this way of thinking where we've got the brain is one thing and the mind is another thing. And instead, we can just say, well, look, there are some neural goings on and there are some mental goings on, and they relate to each other in interesting ways.
But they depend on each other.
Yeah. And so one really interesting way to think about this is that, you've got some neural activity and it gives rise to some mental activity. And some people would say, okay, but the fact that it gives rise to mental activity or experience doesn't do anything. It's just incidental. It's an epiphenomenon. And the comparison is usually like with the whistle of a steam engine, right? The whistle of a steam engine is not doing anything. Um, but the difference there is that the system with a steam engine, the whistle doesn't feed back, right? There's no feedback from the whistle, but there could be.
Mm.
Like you could design a system that, depending on the pitch of the whistle, actually is part of
Yeah.
a control system that feeds back into how the steam engine works. Nothing would stop you from doing that, right? So our mental systems I think well, the way I like to think about this is that the patterns of neural activity that we have in our brains at any moment, you could think about them like an electrical engineer. You could say that here's some nerves, but like when light's hitting my retina, right? So some nerves are being activated, and that pushes electrical activity through my optic nerve to my visual, eventually to my visual cortex, and there's it drives some more neural activity and so on, right? And you could say, okay, well, the systems are configured in such a way that the patterns of neural activity are extracted and so on, but it's really this driving electrical view of a neural machine. And there's another way to think about it, which really flips that, which is to say, actually, what's happening in your brain is that your brain is extracting meaning, not just information, but meaningful information, information about things in the world that is also meaningful in the sense that you care about it, like it's salient. It's not just, it doesn't just refer to something, it refers to something that you care about, right, that you're interested in, because that's the way we've evolved. And actually, what's going on in the brain is that the brain is operating over meaningful patterns of neural activity. So I've got patterns of neural activity in this part of my brain right now that says there's some faces out in the world, right? Because I know that now, I can think about that and I can cognitively operate with that information. It just gets reported to the cognitive economy. It's not just driving some other sets of neurons in a way that's obligately going to result in some action, right? The whole point of having a cognitive system is that I can integrate all that information. And it's not just a set of reflexes, right? I can integrate a load of information and I can flexibly decide what to do about it. So I can make an all things considered judgment about the best thing to do in any scenario. So, so what that means is that that kind of, I guess if we get away from mental and we just call it cognitive, right? We just think of cognitive operations. It's a little less mysterious
Yeah,
sounding, right? It's sort of easier to understand what cognitive operations are doing and
yeah,
why. What are the elements of cognition? What are the objects that we're thinking of? What are the operations that cognition can perform? And that's, everything that cognitive science studies. And so some of those operations are conscious and mentally experienced. And a lot of them are subconscious, right? I mean, a load of the cognitive operations we're just not really aware of. They happen very automatically, subconsciously, and that's good because if we were having to consciously think about them, we'd be really slow. It would be really inefficient, right? So the sort of the highest conscious level of the control system is reserved for those kinds of elements that we have to think about, that we need to integrate because they're complex, because they're novel, right? Because we've never experienced that scenario before, and we have to weigh up all these different things. We don't just run them through a pre-configured algorithm. We have to configure the algorithm. That's what cognition is for, is establishing the weights, not just weighing up with weights that already existed. Um, yeah. Sorry, you know what? I've rambled so much I forgot what the precise question was, but I hope I
no,
at least
no, but
skirted
I like
around it.
it.
Okay.
Is it? Am I understanding it correctly if I say that either a thought, a feeling, whatever, everything starts with a chemical or electrical signal or
Well,
stimuli?
yes. So I guess there's two ways to think about that, right? You can think every mental operation requires some physical medium, right? Just like running the software in this computer requires the hardware and it requires electrons moving around, right? There's a physical basis to this software running right now. And you could say there's a physical basis to the software, if you want to call it that, of cognition, right? There has to be some physical medium. It's not just magical stuff that happens in the air, right? So how should we think about that? One way to think about it is that it's the cognition is nothing but those neural impulses, right? It just is all those neural firings. And once you account for all those neural firings, there's nothing left to account for. So everything I was talking about in terms of the meaning is not really having causal efficacy in the system. You could say, okay, yes, this pattern means something, but in the system itself, what matters is the way the nerves are configured, right? There's a physical basis for it. Now, the rejoinder to that is to say, yes, it's true that at any moment the meaningful pattern is instantiated in some actual physical pattern, but it doesn't matter that much what the physical pattern is. There may be lots of physical patterns at the microscopic level of neural firings that all mean the same thing. And the system is configured to care about the meaning at a higher level. So another way to say that is just that it's extracting higher order features from the neural firings, and those higher order features are multiply realizable. Okay, at the microscopic level, there's lots of patterns that could mean the same thing. Just like when we're reading text, for example, it could be in different fonts, it could be in italics, it could be in capital letters, and we know that all means the same thing. Okay.
Yeah.
So the operations within your nervous system, you can think about them the same way. They're sensitive to higher order patterns. That's where the causal efficacy in the system lies, not in the instantaneous, detailed neural firings. And so you can get away from the sense that you can just reduce everything at the high level to the low level by asking, if I change something in the system at the high or the low level, where do I see an effect? And actually, you can change loads of things at the low level and not have an effect until you change them in a way that changes the meaning. Do you see what I mean?
Partially.
Okay. So it's a tricky way um, to try and get away from the reductive view
Mm,
of neuroscience, which is really, we could think neuroscience set out, at least part some traditions in neuroscience have set out to understand how the mind, how mental activities and cognition and things like that, how psychology is dependent on neural substrates. And it's kind of ironic that at one level we've been so successful at figuring out those neural substrates and how they work that it's almost like we've explained away what was the initial object of our interest, which is how minds work, right? And we're just replacing that with saying, no, it's just brains, right? So whenever you did something, I can say it's because your amygdala was active and your
yep.
visual cortex had this pattern in it, and your prefrontal cortex had a representation of a goal, and all of that thing made the machine that is you do X, right? Um, and so a way to try and get away from that, and a way that I think is just more accurate about what's going on, is that yeah, those low level details are just a bit arbitrary and incidental and variable, and they're super noisy, actually. So it's like it, it's not even possible to actually encode everything in super detailed way at the low level, because there's just fluctuations and noise all the time. So what the nervous system does is encode things at higher order levels in these patterns. That's useful to the organism because those patterns mean something,
Yeah.
right? Because they reflect something out in the world, because they reflect what I can do with something in the world, because they reflect a memory and an experience from experiences that I've had that tells me good things and bad things to do. So it's adaptive to have those neural patterns, to operate over those neural patterns at the level that reflects what they're about, as
Okay.
opposed to being micromanaging the flow of sodium ions across our nerve
Yeah.
membranes,
Yeah.
right? We don't do that. We operate over things at a meaningful level.
Am I right in understanding that every thought we have arises in the unconscious and we just become conscious of a few percent?
Oh, I don't know if I would put it like that. I've never thought about that question that way, and I'm not an expert on consciousness, but I'm trying to think now whether, like, just as we're talking, I'm consciously thinking.
Yeah.
I'm having conscious thoughts. So it feels to me like some of those are arising consciously because I'm actively engaged in cogitation, right? Which, like, a lot of the time we're not. So a lot of the time, I think what we could say, when we're having a thought about what to do, as opposed to a thought that I'm expressing in mentalese language in my brain, right? As opposed to that, when we're having a thought about what to do, there I think some ideas pop into our heads, right? And so a lot of that is subconscious. It's not arbitrary or random because we've got habits of thought, because we have been in certain experiences and scenarios before. Some things are suggested. It's like a recommender system on Netflix. It knows my brain has come to know me. It
Yeah.
comes to know the kinds of things that I like to do and like to say in various scenarios. And then it sort of suggests, hey, maybe, hey, Kev, say this or that. Here's your choices. And then I can sort of consciously deliberate between them. So the yeah, I mean, the big answer is there's all kinds of subconscious processing going on that is still you. It's still part of
Mm.
your mind in a sense. And it may be accessible to consciousness if you direct your attention towards it, right? So it's not necessarily completely opaque to us. It's not that we can't ever see or think about. Like we can introspect. I mean, I could sit right now and say, where have these thoughts been coming from? Or
Mm.
why did I have this idea or thing to do, right? So I think there's a sort of a dynamic um, switching, again, in a control theory sense, between automatic systems that keep us going very efficient, and then these less efficient ones that are more deliberative and introspective that can be called into action when we need them. And
Yeah.
that's Daniel Kahneman has written about this system one and system two thinking. It's a little bit of an arbitrary distinction, but the general idea, I think, is quite good.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just asking because people like Sam Harris, Robert Sapolsky, they keep saying that you're not the author of your thoughts. They just
Yeah,
arise.
yeah, which is interesting. So Sam Harris uses an example, which so he'll just ask people to think of a city, right? And they do so. They sit there, and literally something pops into your mind. You can almost feel it happening, right?
Yeah.
And if he asks you why you thought of
San
it, you can
Francisco.
yes, that's a good one, right? Okay, yeah. Paris, right, is one that I often think of. But that's an example where nothing rides on that, right? It's just this issue where it doesn't matter, right? It's inconsequential what pops to mind. As we're talking right now, words are popping to mind that I could say. Those are not inconsequential, right? I'm thinking of those for reasons. And if I stop for a moment, I could tell you what the reason is that I chose one word over another, right? So Sam Harris is not wrong when he uses that example to say thoughts are just popping into your head. It's just that that example is very, very particular, and it's not, you just can't extrapolate from that to everything, right? So a lot of the time we're having thoughts, reasons, and ideas and goals, and yes, we can introspect on them. It's not a mystery to us. We're not just going around behaving randomly or arbitrarily all the time. We're following our goals. We have behavioral agendas. We have plans and projects that we're carrying out. And in any particular context, we're juggling all those different goals and plans and projects and ongoing things. And then we may want to switch. We may see something new happens. We may have to adapt. We may have to accommodate to new information. You know, all of that is, or a lot of that is accessible to us in introspection. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a problem in the free will literature in general that people will say, look, here's this example where you don't know why you did that, or there were some subconscious influences on your behavior. And then they just infer everything. Everything we do is like that. And it's just not justified. It's a non sequitur. It just doesn't follow.
Then how would you respond to Benjamin Lebay's work where they showed that before you became conscious, it started like 300 milliseconds before?
Yeah, it's a great example of exactly the same issue of this over extrapolation. So in that experiment, all that people have to do is they flick their wrist whenever the urge takes them. That's what the experimenter has told them. So literally, as as random and arbitrary as possible, right? All you need to do is just wait for this urge to arise. And you know what people do in that scenario is they sort of decide to actually use a system in their brain that can accumulate noise. So ordinarily, there's a system in our brain that is accumulating evidence. So before we do things, when we encounter some scenario, we may have a degree of uncertainty or a low confidence in what's going on. It may take us a while to figure out what the actual scenario is, and through some time, what's a good thing to do, right? So there are systems in our brain that can accumulate evidence that is pushing us towards or favoring one behavior versus another, right? Now, in the absence of any reason to do anything, where there's no evidence coming in, right? You've just been told to act on an urge. Actually, we can just accumulate noise. Those systems can just accumulate noisy firings because of the way synaptic plasticity works within that brain area. And so in the Libet experiments, I think what people do is they sit down, they decide deliberatively to take part in this experiment and to follow the experimenter's request to flick their wrist every once in a while. And then this is really an example of letting their brain decide when to do that. Um, it doesn't mean that every decision that we make is like that. In fact, you can set up the experiment with the exact same experimental setup, where it matters to the person what they do because they're flicking their right or their left wrist. And in this case, a charity is getting money. A charity that they care about is getting money, depending on which one they do. When you do that, you don't see this, what's called a readiness potential in their brain that precedes the feeling of when to move. So, yeah, I think it's really important when thinking about these things to understand that there's a diversity of decision-making scenarios and mechanisms and strategies that we use, and each of them is actually adaptive, right? It's really adaptive in a scenario where you don't know the best thing to do, or you don't care about the outcome. It's just totally inconsequential. You're just indifferent to it, but you should do something, right? That's the important thing, is you should not just sit there saying, well, I don't know which of these to do. I don't know whether to order Coke or Pepsi. Therefore, I'm just going to sit here and die of thirst because I can't break the deadlock, right? So, yeah, we have systems to break that are like symmetry breaking systems to break a tie. That's a really good strategy to have in that scenario. It's not a good strategy to use that kind of a system in a scenario where it does matter whether you do A or B, right? That becomes really consequential. There, we weigh up decisions in a highly deliberative kind of a fashion. That's very different, right? And then you can have other scenarios where we've pre-decided, right? We've been through this experience loads and loads of times. We've paid attention to it. We've learned from that, and we've developed a habit. And now that habit reflects our settled will, right? Just because it's automatic doesn't mean it's not an expression of your free will. It's just that it's an expression of your free will over time. And now, I can just do this without having to think about it too much. So I think, it's important to survey and understand that diversity of decision making, not so as not to fall into this trap of finding one experimental setup that looks like you don't know what you're doing or why you did it, and then say, well, we never do.
Yeah. So would that explanation be the same for I'm driving in traffic, there's someone stopping ahead of me, I have to brake immediately. I'm guessing there's a readiness potential that I'm not aware of it, that my braking starts before I become conscious of pressing the brake pedal.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I had that experience myself recently where a fox ran out in front of me and I swerved before, and I was struck by the fact that I had moved before I
Yeah.
consciously perceived that there was a fox there, right? Again, super adaptive to have a situation where you've got subconscious processes of vision that can be acted upon, so they can inform action prior to your conscious vision. And so conscious vision is interesting because it takes time to draw an inference of what it is you saw, and then we actually predict backwards in time a little bit. So we retrodict what happened. So conscious vision is a slower process than subconscious, and it's useful because that can be then that can inform or give some information for our higher cognitive systems. We can say, oh, there's a fox out there. Now I can think about there being a fox out there. But in the meantime, I better swerve the car, right? So, yeah, I think this is sort of a really, really fascinating issue about how long that window is of
Mm.
of retrodiction. And actually, there's some super cool experiments you can do where you can flash like a green disk on a computer screen and then very rapidly flash a red disk or circle near it, right? And if you do that super fast, it looks like there's movement between. And you actually see something, you infer it's not two flashes, it's a thing moving from here to there. And you infer it looks like a bar moving, right? The super interesting thing is that halfway through that bar that was never on the computer screen, but that you infer existed, it changes color, right? It goes from
Mm.
green to red. So that's just really good evidence that your conscious experience is an inference backwards in time of what happened. Because not only are you inferring something that didn't happen, you're inferring that it happened after the fact that you saw the red disk
Mm.
and backwards in time through this transition. And I think basically all of our conscious vision is like that. It's this retrodictive inference about what has been going on, because you need to accumulate enough evidence to be confident about that before this sort of conscious inference is uh, is reliable enough to be worth telling the rest of the brain, basically.
Yeah. But I'm guessing there it's important to have a clear definition of what free will actually is. I'm guessing people have separate definitions of free will. I'm guessing Sam Harris has a different one from yours, etc.
Yeah.
But could it be more correctly to say that the unconscious brain has free will, but the conscious brain does not?
I don't think so. I think most people would invert that actually and say, for some people, their conception of free will, at least, is that it's the rational brain which has to be in charge. And so some people would set that up as a contrast with emotional impulses, where what they would say is like, look, if I'm just acting on my emotional impulses and I wasn't in control of myself, then I didn't have free will when I committed that action. And you can look at infants, for example, and toddlers and so on, and you can see, well, they're like that, right? They're little impulse machines, and they really do act out those very immediate kind of motivations. And they have not yet developed the systems of rational control, or what we call, executive function, that characterize adult human beings when they're exercising the greatest degree of control over their own actions, when they can um, prioritize longer term goals over short term gain, and when they can integrate lots of information, when they can plan further into the future. So some people would say, and I think it's reasonable enough to say that that's what characterizes free will. And when we're talking about free will, that's the kind of thing most people are talking about. Right? However, there's tons of other ways that you can think about it, right? And there's lots of different conceptions in both neuroscience and philosophy that as starting points can be problematic. So one of those conceptions would be if you're not free from any prior cause whatsoever when you do something, then you don't have
Mm.
free will, right? So
Mm.
that's just an absolutist way of thinking about it.
Yeah, because Sapolsky in his books Behave and Determine, he states that if you have free will, every neuron in your brain has to be removed from all prior experiences.
Yeah, and so there's two aspects there that he's got. So there's which I think are both unhelpful. One is the absolutism. And if you think about that, right, if you think about what it would be like to be free of any prior causes whatsoever. So the idea is like, I don't want to be doing things just because of my personality or my genetics or the experiences that have happened to me. If all I'm doing is acting out those influences, then where am I in the picture? I'm not doing anything, right? I'm totally constrained. Now, you don't have to say you're totally constrained. You can admit, and everybody does, totally accept that there are these prior influences on you
Mm.
that make you who you are. And then you can say, okay, there's still some leeway for you as an agent and an entity to decide, given all of those things, given your genetic makeup, given all of your past experiences, given everything that makes you who you are, that's what you bring to the table.
Mm.
That's how you make a decision, right? Being you making a decision as opposed to a random behavior generator, which is all you would be if there were none of those constraints on you, right? So those constraints is just what it is to be you. There's nothing else. There's nothing else about you except those constraints that makes you you, right? So that the absolutist version, this sort of uncaused cause version, just sort of seems incoherent in the sense that anything that had that power wouldn't be the kind of entity that we are, right? It's not something a human being could have and still be a human being.
Mm.
The other aspect of this then is the dualist version, which Sapolsky, I think, is, falls into, where he would say your free will has to be something that's in biology, but not of biology, or it's in the brain, but not of the brain, which is a kind of a weird phrasing to my mind, because it's almost like he said, well, it's not almost, he does say that if we find that your decision making involves things in your brain, then clearly it's not you, it's your brain doing it.
Mm.
Well, there's just no need to take that stance, right? It's a dualist stance because if you follow that logic enough, then you'll find that the only thing that would satisfy him is a ghost in the machine, right? It's a really non-naturalistic um, set of criteria to have for what would count as free will in his in his philosophy. So, if you're just going to set it up that way, if you're just going to define it that way from the get-go, well, then you could just stop. There's no need to write the other 500 pages of the book. You could just say free will could only be magic. We don't believe in magic, therefore there's no free will. Like, okay, but you don't have to think about it that way. Instead, you can think in a more naturalistic way and say, well, free will is just the words that we use for a set of evolved biological capacities that we human beings have and that other organisms have to differing degrees to control our behavior in the world, right? To cause things to happen in the world, to cognitively integrate lots of information, to integrate that with our current goals and plans and agendas and modify our behavior as we go along as holistic entities, as
Mm.
selves, right? As persons, not just as machines acting out some kind of pre-programming, because the whole point of our cognition, our cognitive system, is that evolution couldn't pre-program every a good thing to do in every complicated scenario. I mean, it does that for simple creatures that have simple lifestyles, but we evolved a lifestyle that allows us to be cognitively flexible. That's our superpower, right? That really involves decision making by you, using
Yeah.
your brain, as opposed to being pushed around by isolated things happening within your brain.
Could you speak a bit about the influence of genetics in this topic or on this topic?
Sure, yeah. So one of the reasons I wrote this book, Free Agents, was because I had previously written that book that's up there, Innate, which is about how our brains are shaped by our genetics. So first of all, how human brains are shaped by us having a human genome, different from a chimp genome or a tiger genome or a fly genome, but how there's also variation on that theme, right? So we don't all have the human genome, we all have our own human genome. And so there's some variation in the way that our brain physically develops, just like there's variation in the way that our faces and bodies physically develop, even though we all have human faces and bodies, right? So that variation in brain structure and brain wiring manifests as differences in behavior. and differences in things like intelligence and perception and all kinds of other behavior, sexuality, all sorts of things, but also personality traits, right? And when we think about personality traits, really what they are descriptors of decision making, patterns of or tendencies of decision making. So you might say that someone who is more extroverted than someone else, when they're making a decision, they have some weights or tunings that are different from that other person. So they may weight social activities as more internally rewarding than the other person. When they're making a decision about what to do, that may lead them as a pattern, more often than not, to tend to, go out to a party as opposed to sit at home reading a book, right? To take a really sort of trivial example, right? Okay, now the question is, are they determining what you do? Are those pre-tunings just determining what we do at every moment? Or are they just a starting point that influences the way that we come to interact with the world, such that as we go through our lives, that's part of ourselves. Those tunings are definitely there, right? They're part of ourselves. They influence the way that as we have experiences, what we find rewarding and not, what we tend to seek out, what environments we tend to create for ourselves, what things we tend to prioritize, right? And the crucial word there is tend. Those are tendencies. They're not
Mm.
determinants. So, just partly because there's not enough information. There's no information in those tunings about things in the world, right? So if I'm more or less risk averse, if you knew my whole personality profile and I said, no, well, now I'm going to be in this situation, what am I going to do? You could not predict what I'm going to do because what I'm going to do also depends on everything I've learned through my life, all the habits and policies that I've made, and so on. So you need to think of a trajectory, right? It's not just like a robot with certain tunings right now, and you plop it in this situation, it's definitely going to do A. You plop it in that situation, it's definitely going to do B, like it's some instantaneous thing. We have a history, right? And our history starts with the way that our brain is wired when we're born, but it doesn't end there, right? That's this gradual emergence of who we are in a process that we're involved in. And this is another crucial difference between my sort of interpretation of what's going on and someone like Robert Sapolsky. So Robert would say, yes, it's a trajectory, but all of it reflects your genetics, it reflects human evolution generally, it reflects things that happen to you in the womb, and then all the other things that have happened to you. Right. So it's a very passive kind of a view where at any moment, because he thinks you can never make a choice, you're not involved in anything that happens. You're not involved in the construction of your own character through time.
Mm.
Whereas if you take a view where, okay, these are influences, but at any moment it's still something is up to you about what choices to make, then you are involved and you can make choices about what kinds of choices you want to make. You can make choices about what kind of motivations you think you should have, right? We can be involved in our own character emergence through time that, in a way that just goes way, way, way beyond these sort of early, very basic tunings that our genetics might set.
How useful would you say those personality tests are?
It depends on what you want to use them for, right? So they can be useful for thinking about patterns of behavior, but not specific instances of behavior, except in a really, really probabilistic sense, right? So, I don't know, some companies and employers and things like that like to use them. They say they're predictive of certain things. I don't know how useful they are. I guess it depends what question you're asking. You can look at some life outcomes though, and say that they are correlated with these things. So neuroticism, for example, how much you tend to worry about things, how strongly you weigh negative consequences of actions, and so on, is actually a predictor of some long-term health outcomes and life outcomes. So that can be true without it being useful, right? It can be a true observation that those things are correlated and
Yeah.
predictive because you really are predicting life outcomes in the future. Then the question is that a useful thing to know? And that's just a separate kind of a pragmatic question, is like, what are you trying to use them for? But I like to think about them as like knowing something about the climate as opposed to being able to predict the weather on any moment. So you can know the climate, right? It tends to be rainier in Ireland than it is in Spain. Does that mean I can predict it's raining right now? No, I
Mm.
can't. That depends on all kinds of other stuff, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the way I tend to think about them. They're statistical, they're designed, right? Expressly designed to statistically abstract away from the particulars of any context or any individual life, because they're psychologists want to see the global patterns or dimensions along which people's personality tends to vary, right? So they're not designed to make predictions about individual people at any given moment. They're designed to say across the population, here are the ways that people vary. They vary in how extroverted they are, and they vary independently in how neurotic they are. And that's useful information to know about the landscape of human cognition and behavioral control.
Yeah. Would you say that these things changes from young to old, both uh, personality, but also I'm thinking about it's probably the wrong way of thinking it, but free will, does it differ from from young to old? Because more information, more experiences, more knowledge should, in theory, make you able to make better decisions, but at the same time, you're more set in how you do things.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right there, right? Okay, so there's some sort of trade-offs between um, learning and acting, right? So basically what happens in if we think of development from, from being when you're born through childhood up to adulthood, then we have this sort of process of really exploratory process. So infants are playing, right, where they're basically exploring things in the world. They're trying things out. Usually they're allowed to do that. They have the luxury of doing that because they have parents or other caregivers who give them a secure, safe environment in which to play without lethal consequences, usually, right? So that's really important then. There's this sort of wide open time when they don't have ingrained habits yet. They're still building a model of the world. And
Yeah.
in order to do that, they need to be really exploratory. They need to be curious. So their curiosity is dialed to 11 and they're constantly trying stuff out. And as they do that, they gradually build this model of the world that becomes more and more complex. And as they're doing that, the processes of synaptic plasticity are also set to 11 in at
Mm.
early ages, but they actually get tuned down, right? So biochemically, neurochemically, the brain becomes less plastic over time. So as we mature, we get to stages where we go through these critical periods where its brain is just this massive learning machine. It's just absorbing information and it's recalibrating things. It's building this world model. But at a certain point, it's adaptive for us to just say, okay, I think I've got it for the most
Mm.
part. I'm not going to keep reconfiguring this world model all the time because that would actually hamper me doing productive things. I would never have anything to rely on to make plans and so on. So in order to actually do stuff, you need to kind of say, okay, look, I got it mostly. I'm going to tweak the particulars here, but my model is mostly set. And I think when we reach adulthood, we're at that point, right? Of course, we're still learning stuff as we go along, but we've developed a more crystallized form of intelligence. So we don't just have this fluid intelligence, which allows us to figure out on the fly for any novel scenario what's the right thing I should do. Right? We're working through all the parameters instead and stuff. Instead of that, we have this crystallized intelligence, which you can think of as a set of habits of thought. We have this world model. We have things we know, and usually that world model will have served us well up to that point because we're still alive. And so it's adaptive to just rely on that for the most part, as long as the world is not changing. Right? So our
Mm.
model has been good up till now. For example, our weather models have been good up till now. Now, because of climate change, they're shit. So now we have to reconfigure, right? So that's a scenario globally, but individually, we may encounter scenarios where the model that we had just turns out to not be working so well anymore. It's just not as predictive or adaptive as it used to be. And then, well, two things could happen. Either we stick with it, we get stuck in a rut, we're now in maladaptive patterns of behavior that are no longer fit for purpose, or we
Mm.
realize that it's no longer good and we make some kind of a change. We update, right? A big update, like a retrospective kind of thing. Is like, wait. All of this now doesn't hold, right? Not
Yeah.
just particulars, but something big. So, yeah, so I think as we look over time, in three dimensions, I think we see changes. First of all, in personality traits, there are personality trait changes with time that are very consistent over multiple ages. So, you know, teenagers are higher in extroversion, higher in openness to experience, higher in risk taking than either younger children or adults. Right? That's very consistent. Although within the set of teenagers, you still see personality differences that reflect individual differences. Right? The same is true as you go to old age. Extroversion goes down, but openness to experience goes down. But neuroticism also goes down. Right? People just, younger people are just sort of more worried about stuff. Right?
Yeah.
Um, so that's true. In terms of cognition and intelligence, we have this move from fluid intelligence, which actually goes down with age, but it's offset by this crystallized intelligence. I mean, you could call it wisdom, right? It's our
Yeah.
accumulated learnings that are actually pretty good for most of the stuff that we need to do in our daily lives. Maybe we get a little bit less good at knowing what to do with really novel information or think about new things entirely, right? And then the third element is actually what I would call agency or behavioral control, where, we already talked about where you go from infants to adulthood, where that kind of behavioral control is increasing. I haven't really thought about it much in terms of beyond that, in terms of going into old age, whether agency increases or decreases, except in sort of pathological terms where, if you have people with dementia, for example, then I would say agency and autonomy goes down because they're no longer able to incorporate new information and new memories as quickly as they could, or sometimes not able at all to do that. And so, yeah, I think we can, for all of those things, it's important to think of them in degrees, right? And get away from this absolute framing. Something has free will or doesn't, has agency
Yeah.
or doesn't. It's like 0 or 100. That's just not a useful framing. We can see gradations. We can see it across lifetimes. We can see it between individuals. We can see it in different scenarios in our own lives if we're really just in a scenario where we're stressed or harried or hurried or busy. We're exercising less overt rational control and we're more sort of impulsive, right? Yeah, so I like to think in terms of variation in degrees and kind as opposed to yes or no, absolute have it or
Yeah.
don't kind of
Yeah.
right lines.
The way you argue, would you say this is a view of how things are, or is this a theory?
That's interesting. So I guess I like to think of it as a framework. Certainly the framework that I look at in the book, which takes an evolutionary approach. So what I try to do is say, okay, here's this mystery in that we think about when we look at humans. They seem to be able to do things for reasons, and yet they're physical beings made of physical stuff. They have constraints due to their history, yet they seem to have some freedom and control. How could that be? Right? And it's just really complicated because we're really complicated in terms of our cognition. So one way to address a really complicated problem is to find a simpler version of it and then build your way towards the complex thing, right? And of course, that's exactly what evolution did. So we can follow that evolutionary trajectory and say, rather than starting with the most complex thing, trying to understand that, let's build up some concepts that we need from much simpler things. So from the origin of life, for example, just thinking about single-celled organisms, how do they make things happen, right, in the world? What should we think about that? What does it mean to say they have a purpose? Because nothing non-living has a purpose. Then when life emerged, suddenly, that's a new thing in the universe, purpose. And when you have purpose, you have value relative to that purpose. Something can be good or bad relative to the purpose of persisting, say. And before that, there wasn't anything good or bad. Nothing mattered to anything in the universe before that kind of thing emerged. So once we see life emerge, we get purpose and value and meaning. We get informational kinds of causation, not just physical stuff bumping into each other, but organisms trying to figure out what's out in the world and what they should do about it, right? Trying to do adaptive behavior, basically.
Yeah.
So if we anchor those concepts, then we can scaffold on top of those. And that's what I try to do. That's what evolution has done. So that's why I call it a framework, because I think within that framework, um, if it's right, and it's all arguable, but within that framework, we can slot in new findings, right? So if tomorrow somebody finds out something about the way goals are represented in the prefrontal cortex and how they constrain action plan selection in the supplementary motor area, we can slot that into that framework. It doesn't undermine it. It's just a new piece of information, right? So yeah, I think that's the way that I think about it. Framework maybe is a better word than either view, which just sounds like a kind of a arbitrary opinion that doesn't necessarily have much evidence behind it, or theory, which in scientific terms is probably a much bigger kind of a thing where it's really well worked out. There may be some quantitative mathematical sort of formalisms underlying it and so on. So I'm not going to say it's grand enough to be a theory, but it's a framework for incorporating philosophical issues, neuroscience, genetics, development, evolution, all, I hope all of those things in a way that is consistent and coherent. And certainly for me, in working through that process, I have found that helps me sort of make sense of these things and think about them.
Yeah, interesting. How would this framework stack up to the physical laws and the block universe? Like I started with a question about my right or left foot out of
Yeah,
bed.
yeah, yeah.
Like is there anything that exists that is not actual? I guess my question. Is there
Oh,
only the actual?
yeah. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions here. One is a question about physics, and the other is a philosophical question about the potential and the actual. Both really interesting and related to each other. So the really deterministic view of physics is that you have the state of the universe at one given time, any given time, and the laws of physics, and the laws of physics determine completely what the state of the universe will be like at the next moment, and the moment after that, and after that, and after that. So this is the Laplacian view of the universe, where everything is just given, right? If you know what the universe is like at any given state, you can infer what it will be like at every moment in the future and in the past. And actually, interestingly, there's no arrow of time. And there's nothing distinguishing the present from any other moment, right? And the same is true in Einstein's block universe. There's no explanation for why it's always now, which
Hmm.
seems like a pretty fundamental aspect of our phenomenology that needs some explaining, is that there is a distinction between the present and the future and the past, right? And there is an arrow that's going towards the future. So a lot of the, physical theories don't supply an explanation for that. Now, if you accept, however, that physics doesn't actually support that deterministic view, right? Nothing in physics supports that. It's not supported in quantum physics. We know, I think most people are aware, there's some randomness in how things play out. But it's actually not supported in classical physics either. And the reason is that you can't have a definite state of the universe at any time. Never mind the fact that there's no such thing as a given time thanks to relativity. But you can't have an infinitely precise state of the universe because, first of all, it runs up against the Heisenberg uncertainty principle and other issues, but it also would require infinite information to be compressed into some finite amount of space, right? The state of the universe right now, especially if it was at the Big Bang, it was teeny weeny, right? So you can't compress all the information about every future state of the universe, which is infinite, into a finite amount of physical space. There has to be some indefiniteness at play, right? Some little bit of fuzziness when you get down to really small scales. It's just not the case, or at least physics doesn't say it is, that there is such a thing as an infinitely precise definition of the universe. And if it's not infinitely precise, if things are jittering around a little bit, then there can be some random play in what happens, right? Because you're not submitting some infinitely precise set of numbers. You're submitting numbers with some fuzziness at the ends, and then things can play out lots of different ways, depending on what kind of system it is. What that means is there are things that are in potentia, right? They're potential things that could happen. But it's not, it's probabilistic what might happen. So the way I like to think about this is there's not just one sacred timeline that goes forever, right? Where nothing branches. But there's also not really the way of thinking about it. Like there's future paths that are laid out and we're just choosing between them. And a little bit of randomness is pushing one way or another occasionally, where like the default is deterministic physics, but occasionally some random thing pushes in and pushes you one way or the other. I don't think that's the right way to think about it either. Instead, what you can say is that actually at any moment, the next physical instant is underdetermined by the current low-level laws of physics. And as you go further and further and further into the future, it becomes more and more underdetermined to the point where at some point there's just no truth value to whether something will or won't happen. It's just indefinite, right? So I could say that with a certain probability that it's going to rain here tomorrow, and that would be constrained pretty tightly by the current models of the weather system and so on. But a year from now, there's no constraint, right? It's just there's no truth value to the proposition that it will rain a year from now. It's not, there isn't a yes or no answer, right? It just is indefinite. That goes against a whole sort of fundamental idea in logic that there has to be a yes or no answer to propositions. And actually, you can just reject that and say, no, there doesn't have to be. Some things don't have an answer yet, right? And in the future, that's what makes the future the future. Things are indefinite. What makes the present is it's the time when that indefiniteness is getting resolved as systems are interacting with each other. They're catching each other mid-jitter and having some interaction that plays out that fixes things, and then that becomes the past. So in that context, what that means for free will is that because things are underdetermined by the low-level laws of physics, many things could happen. That creates some scope in the system for the way the system is organized at a macroscopic level to constrain what actually does happen. And that's basically what living organisms are doing. They're constraining all these physical goings on that would otherwise be a bit random and would lead to dissolution of the organism. They're constraining that such that the macroscopic pattern keeps persisting through time, right? They propagate themselves as a pattern through time. So they make themselves happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
It
but
was a lot because I never thought I would get into all this sort of stuff in physics and what does time even mean and so on. But it turns out when you get into the discussions of free will, those questions of whether it's just often set against determinism, and then determinism means multiple things. Sometimes it means that physical predeterminism, which we can just reject as just not being supported by physics. Sometimes it means the higher level sort of psychological predeterminism, which, Sapolsky talks about, which I think we can also reject because it doesn't fit with psychology or cognitive science or neuroscience.
Yeah. I guess you also could come in to talking about the many worlds interpretation, but let's not go there. But is it right to say that whatever happens, just one thing happens, other things could happen, but only one thing becomes actual, and the thing you speak about, is that more of a useful conceptual thinking?
Well, yeah, I mean, for me, it's the necessary starting point for thinking about free will is that options exist.
Yeah.
Just ontologically in the physical universe, multiple things could happen. If it's just were the case that only one thing could ever happen, then what are we even talking about? There's no one's doing anything. Stuff is just happening, right?
Yeah.
And like I said, there's not even an arrow of time. There's no causes. There's no cause and effect in that kind of universe because causes and effects need an arrow of time. Um, so, but anyway, yeah. So we just don't have to accept that premise because physics doesn't say that that's the case, right? In fact, there's loads of evidence to the contrary
Mm.
that things are that the future is genuinely open. And that's just the starting point. That's just the first necessary requirement to think about how we could have systems that control anything or make something happen. Just that there are possibilities that they can work with, right? Yeah.
Mm. Last question. What would you say about the power of thought? How can we use our thoughts to change? Can we shape our future?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we do that all the time. So this gets back to what I was talking about earlier about patterns of neural activity being meaningful. So you what we can see is that the neural systems are configured to be responsive to the meaning of neural patterns. So if we want to think about mental causation, right, this is one of these sort of hangups that people have when they're talking about free will. Actually, what they're concerned with is this notion that a thought, which sounds like an immaterial sort of thing or an abstract sort of thing, could push physical stuff around, right? That sounds like a magical idea. How could that possibly happen? And I think the way to get around that is to realize that a thought is not immaterial in that sense, in that it has a material basis. It's a pattern of neural activity. Patterns of neural activity can have causal efficacy in your brain. That's how the brain works, right? But the important thing is that the efficacy that it has depends on what it means. That's the way the system works. It's not just driving neurons driving each other all over the place. It's this neuron asking a question, what's going on over here, and interpreting its inputs. Right? So the way that the system is configured is doing work that we call cognition. So when we're thinking about things, these neural patterns are, these are flows of neural activity through in our brain that are instantiating that cognition. They're the medium through which that is happening, just like the electrons flowing in my computer are the medium of the software that I'm running right now being executed. Right? But the important thing is, like in the computer there, those electrons are being constrained by the software that's running, because I'm running
Mm.
Zoom right now and not other things, right? So in our brains, we can also constrain the way the system is configured at any moment. I mean, it's configured based on our history, as we've been talking about, but it's also configured on the fly. So for example, when I adopt a goal, say I decide to go play golf, right? And now I have adopted a goal, right? I've had a thought I should play some golf. Playing golf entails hitting the stupid little ball into the hole, right? Now I have a goal that's constraining my actions. So by thinking about that, wanting to play some golf, there's physical stuff happening in my brain that's constraining the choices, the options that occur to me of things to do when I'm
Mm.
playing golf, which involve hitting the little ball, right? And even getting frustrated when it doesn't go where I want it to go.
Yeah.
But even more sort of immediately, a lot of our mental control is actually attention. It's selection, right? We're selecting what to pay attention to in the world, and by doing that, we're prioritizing certain things in our decision-making processes. So I can be selecting to the words that you're saying to me in this conversation as opposed to paying attention to other things in my office here or my emails or something like that, right? So that act of paying attention is altering the momentary configuration of synaptic connections in the brain, right? It's up or down weighting some connections over others, such that these ones have priority in the decision-making system, and these other ones are being ignored. So all of that doesn't have to be mystical, right? We understand a lot about the neuroscientific underpinnings of those kinds of mechanisms. And the question again is just a perspective view is like, what do we think about that? Do we see in those processes us mentally thinking about stuff and controlling what we do? Or whenever we see something neuroscientific, do we say, oh, that's just your brain doing it. You didn't do anything. And I just think I just totally reject that view. There's just no need whatsoever to have that reductive, eliminativist kind of approach to neuroscience, because it doesn't have to eliminate the self just because we understand how it works.
Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
I feel like that was a lot because you went to some deep questions there. So yeah, I think we probably might have taxed listeners' brains enough, certainly taxed mine. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Last question then. What is the meaning of life?
Uh, yeah, that's a good one. The meaning of life, I guess, would be persistence, actually. I mean, not to be trite about it, but um, yeah, I think living beings, their drive is just to persist. And everything else is kind of scaffolded on that in an evolutionary sense. Of course, because we've almost transcended that at one level with our cognitive systems. We can have lots of goals that aren't directed at that, which is good. Um, but yeah, I think, life exists because it can. It's allowed that the complex system can evolve in a universe where the future is somewhat open and everything is not just determined by low-level physics. That's why you can get living things. And then once they're there, then they have their own dynamic, which is, this sort of evolutionary exploration of the possibility space of forms that are good at persisting in different kinds of ways.
I really enjoyed this, Kevin. Thank you very much.
Great. Oh, it was my pleasure. Thanks a lot.